Well, we're back now with our panel to try to make some sense of all that's going on, and that's a large order right now. Ann Gearan is the diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post. We welcome her to Face the Nation. Bobby Ghosh is the editor of Time International, also a Washington Post columnist and former George W. Bush speechwriter Michael Gerson, as well as CBS News State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan. Well, when you left, Margaret, I said we're going to give you time to go back and get on the phone and see if you can sort this out. Have you found out anything more?
Well, they're trying to figure this out at the White House and here in Washington right now. What we heard earlier today from the Russian Foreign Ministry is that there's now this broader conversation about finding a diplomatic solution through constitutional reform. That is different from what the message sent very clearly by the Kremlin at the same time, which was, we're not changing our foreign policy. This referendum's still happening in Crimea today. We're going to recognize the results of it. And basically, Putin saying we're not backing down, but we'll continue to talk diplomatically, is what Lavrov, the foreign minister, told Kerry today, the Secretary of State here. So it looks like there is a broader conversation right now, but it doesn't look like there's an immediate halt in any way.
Well, Bobby, do you think this means the Russians are just buying time, or is there something significant happening here?
Yes, I think it is a question. It is an attempt to buy time. And I think when the Russians now talk of we'll continue to have discussions about Ukraine, I suspect the Russians are thinking of Ukraine as a country without Crimea. I think in the rush for the Putin administration, Crimea is already a done deal, and what we're seeing taking place today with the referendum today is the final dotting of the I and crossing of the T. That's done. What Lavrov seems to be saying, if I'm reading the tea leaves right, is that let's talk about the rest of Ukraine, because there's still a conversation to be had about that.
Is that your analysis, Ann?
Yeah, I mean, I think this statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry is elliptical enough that we don't know totally what it means. It could be as simple as an agreement to keep talking. Well, I mean, Kerry and Lavrov have been talking every day and sometimes twice a day for about 2 weeks now. And so just the two of them talking really isn't that significant. It could also be an indicator, though, that what the Obama administration hoped for out of the Kerry-Lavrov meeting in London on Friday, at least some small part of that might be happening, which is that there could be a second act after the vote, that either Russia would not move for a full annexation, would do some sort of vague half measure, or that there could be some other kind of way to leave the precise status of Crimea in enough doubt that it isn't a complete in-your-face move by Russia. And there's some indication that something along those lines might be in the works.
Michael, do you agree with Tom Donilon? He says there really are some things that we can do. That this talk that there really is not much we can do when you come right down to it.
Well, I think the response we've just seen hasn't been very forceful. You have Europe internally debating a fairly weak set of incremental sanctions on Russia. You have senators in the U.S. Senate, Republican senators, defeating aid to Ukraine on absurd reasoning. And you have the president seemingly turning down emergency military aid to the Ukrainians, which seems to have been requested according to the Wall Street Journal. That's something, even if you do want to turn it down, you don't say that you're going to turn it down. You want to create uncertainty in a situation like this. But I actually agree. I think if the Russians move in a major way, there are steps you can take about military aid, which Donilon mentioned, about sanctions on oil and gas, which really hurt Europe, but also really hurt Russia. These are and also measures with NATO, U.S. Military engagement with NATO that could send a real signal.
Margaret, what do you think is going to happen next week? Secretary Kerry said, there will be steps. When we last heard from him, this was before this announcement today by the Russians. But I find it significant that have we confirmed that they even had this phone call yet?
They have been talking, yes, yeah. Kerry and Lavrov. And when we landed, Ann and I were on the plane with Kerry coming back here to the U.S. From those conversations on Friday, and he was going to the White House to have more conversations there to consult on what he had spent 6 hours talking to Sergei Lavrov about, because we know Lavrov refused to discuss Crimea. What did they talk about for 6 hours then? So we know that there are some diplomatic measures underway here. But what we hear is coming in terms of sanctions, this cost that you heard President Obama talk about. it sounds like it will be very targeted at individuals in particular within the Russian government, but not Vladimir Putin's money, not Sergei Lavrov's money. That would really hurt. But this is going to be a targeted sanction. It's not going to be that massive hit. And what we've heard from diplomats is that some of this might be scaled up gradually to match basically the level of bad behavior that continues on the part of the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, they don't want to let loose with all barrels all at once. So, but there will definitely be some sanctions action tomorrow, both U.S. and European. The U.S. sanctions are actually the larger and more significant in an odd way, even though Europe does more business with Russia. And there will definitely be some in response to the Crimea referendum. But from the U.S. side, they'd like a couple things to happen in concert. One is that they show a show of force with sanctions, leave themselves some room to add additional sanctions later, and also that they get enough backing from the European Union. Germany is a difficult one there, that it doesn't look like a U.S.-only action.
Now, the problem here is the overall ambition of the Russian argument. They are using Russian minority rights to dismember neighbors and to relitigate the end of the Cold War. There are 25 million Russian minorities outside the Russian border, including in NATO allies, Estonia, Latvia, others. This kind of thing, I think the administration understands, and Europe is beginning to understand, has to be deterred before it becomes even more disturbing and destabilizing.
Well, what about that?
I think the ship has sailed already on that. I think Anne's the expression was perfect. It's a show of force. These sanctions targeted at mid-level officials. It's only a show, and it's a show that is designed more for domestic audiences here in the U.S. and for NATO allies than the Russian side of things. I think these are things that Putin can and will brush off his lapel quite easily. For sanctions to have any effect, you need two things. One, they need to really bite, and you need a considerable international sort of unity behind these sanctions. As we've seen in Iran, they've been quite effective. In Syria, not so much. And the reason they're not so effective in Syria is because there is not that international unity. You're not going to get that with the Russians.
Explain, Margaret, why this is harder for the Europeans than it is for the United States, for example.
Well, I mean, remember at the heart of this crisis, the beginning of it, it was all about the economy. It was all about a trade deal, right? And a lot of that has to do with the ties of the 28 different countries that make up the EU and the amount of trade that happens between them. But one thing we haven't talked about, and the trump card that Putin continues to hold while we talk in the West about the economic punishment he's about to receive, he can go and look and say, look how much money the Russians have in Ukraine. Not just government investment, the companies they own there, the debt they hold. So when this war of ideas cools off, they still have a tremendous amount of influence in Kiev, no matter who is in power. So that's why the conversation seemingly keeps coming back to what sharp economic tools can be used here. But unwinding the amount of financial tentacles Russia has in Ukraine is impossible to do.
But also, I mean, he can turn off the gas for a good part of Europe because they're getting their gas.
Sure, and what Europe would say in response to that is, well, that also hurts him because he wants our money in exchange for that gas that we're going to use. It's a two-way street there. But that's why you've heard some in Congress and others say, well, let's just try to flood their market with cheap U.S. or European sources of natural gas there.
Which is absolutely impossible. We do not have the infrastructure to supply them with the gas. We have one port that will come on stream 2 winters from now. So if we are going to replace Russian gas, then we're going to ask the Europeans to stay cold for 2 winters. That's just.
And I don't think we should discount that Putin is using a variety of methods of international power that he doesn't have to invade. There are special operations now, Russian special operations going on all over eastern Ukraine, inciting Russian minorities, creating incidents. And then the largest propaganda and disinformation campaign since the death of the Soviet Union we're now seeing in the Ukraine, in Russia, and in the West through various methods as well. So I think Putin is effectively using a variety of methods of expanding Russian power without necessarily having to, send tanks to Kiev.
Would anybody like to volunteer some information on this plane story? I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen a story quite like this one. I mean, where does this go? Does this have international implications? I mean,
it does have international implications. If this plane did indeed fly over several countries to get to somewhere in the Central Asian republics, then questions will be asked about India, Pakistan, and China as to why their radar systems fails. Which and you know, there are lots of, there's already been international implications. The Chinese are very, very unhappy with the way the Malaysians have handled the whole thing, and given the trade ties between those countries, that's something that can hurt Malaysia. It doesn't seem to directly affect us right now, beyond the point that all of us get on planes. I was on a plane this morning, and there is something sort of fundamentally unsettling about the idea that in this day and age, when I can take a picture with my phone and you can tell where I am by just seeing that picture on Instagram, there's something fundamentally disturbing about the fact that a very modern aircraft has disappeared and we don't know a week later where it is.
Can we talk a little about Syria? I mean, which has gotten almost no attention since these two stories have burst onto the front pages and on the TV screens. What's the latest from there, Ann?
Well, we're at the 3-year mark, very, very sad anniversary of a conflict that very quickly became a civil war, and it has been in some form of standoff for 3 years. At the moment, the Assad forces are not winning, but not losing. They are doing better. They've seized a very important rebel town just in the last 24 hours. But the rebels are going to keep fighting. They are looking, as always, for additional Western help, and help also from elsewhere in the Middle East, which comes in just enough form to keep them going.
Yeah, I was just a couple of months ago at the border talking with recent refugees from Syria, mainly from the besieged areas. And I think that people need to understand that these are not bystanders, civilian bystanders in a civil war. They are targets in barrel bomb attacks, in the starvation of whole neighborhoods. Both sides commit atrocities in this. But one side, the Syrian government, is committing atrocities as a tool of national policy to cleanse areas with the support of the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, and where the opposition has not had as reliable international support. So it's not a containable crisis. You see the effects in Jordan. You see the effects in Lebanon, which is being completely overrun. You see a whole generation of Syrian young people that are being lost and radicalized, which could be a huge problem for the region and the world in the future. And most of the world is a bystander in this right now.
Putin, again, is a sponsor of Syria. What does Putin see himself doing right now? What is he trying to reestablish the Russian empire, as it were? Does he feel threatened in some way that maybe those of us in the West are slow to understand? What's going on there?
Right. Diplomats joke, you know, maybe he needs a therapist more than he needs foreign policy advisors at this point. But I think if you put that sort of joking aside, what you see is just very much strategic choices to maintain spheres of influence and to keep the people who are friendly with him in power. You see that with Bashar al-Assad's government. And you heard, I mean, if you look at the whole bureaucratic and diplomatic process that has gone through U.S. policy with pushing these peace talks that we were cheering the Russians on for delivering their guys to bring him to the negotiating table. Well, they got him there, and they didn't do much. In fact, the effectiveness of the killings skyrocketed during the peace process itself. They made a mockery of it. And yet the U.S. has still not publicly said, we're done with the Russians. Clearly they don't have the right intentions in bringing these guys to the table. The diplomacy continues with Russia, and they seem to have achieved what they wanted, which is keeping Assad in power and really hurting the rebels in the process that the U.S. has endorsed.
Have they won in Ukraine, Bobby?
The Russians? They've certainly won in Crimea. Whether they won in Ukraine is left to be seen. They have, as Tom Donilon said earlier, they have arranged the tables at their convenience, to their convenience. Any negotiation now takes place on Putin's terms, not on Obama's terms, not on Kiev's terms. And so, to that extent, yes, they've won.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll be right back. Stay with us.